Chapter 9. Roxy squeezed the steering wheel as Tag carefully placed a ukulele case in the back seat of her pickup along with a small backpack. She'd texted Nash about 20 minutes ago, a simple, headed on a hike up paintbrush. Tag wanted to see it again. She hadn't heard back from him yet, but this ought to go a long way in proving that she could be normal with Tag again. Paintbrush had been one of her and Tag's favorite trails back in high school. It was easy enough that it made for a relaxing afternoon when they had taken it, but long enough to give them some quality time together. Roxy had made sure to grab some headphones so she could avoid listening to Tag's humming and strumming as they hiked. He'd come up with some truly amazing songs back in their high school days when they'd taken hikes like this. Plenty that she'd caught snippets of on the radio before she shut it off, or the ones she'd heard on his first album back before she turned him down and stopped listening to his music to dull the ache of missing him. She didn't know what wounds it would open up if she started hearing him again. Tag stared out the window for the first 10 minutes of the drive as they took the county road deeper into the ranch before they hit another county road that made the climb up into the mountains. Roxy's phone ringing interrupted their silence, and she glanced at the caller ID listed on the screen of her truck. Her sister, Taylor. She glanced over at Tag and moved to press the reject button, but Tag pushed her hand away, making her skin burn at the touch, and tapped the accept button. Miss Taylor Adams, to what do we owe the pleasure? Who is that? Are you with Nash? He sounded just like Tag for a second, Taylor said. Roxy cringed and didn't dare look over at Tag after the reference to her boyfriend. Why was she even worried? Of course Taylor would assume it was Nash and not the man that Roxy hadn't spoken to for years. It is Tag. Tag! Taylor cried in excitement. What are you doing with Roxy? What kind of question is that? He pretended to be offended. Roxy could picture the way her sister's eyebrows must be high on her forehead by now. She knew every bit of the history between the two of them. Even though Taylor was nearly 5 years older than Roxy, they'd grown close after Taylor graduated and went to college. Their mother attributed that to no longer having to live in the same house together, and to Roxy losing her ability to steal Taylor's clothes. Tag, be serious. How is it you get to be lucky enough to hang out in Little River? Born lucky, sweetheart. The only thing that would be better is if you were here. Roxy rolled her eyes at Tag's flirting, the ridiculous way he'd always gone over the top with both her and Taylor. Only back then, Taylor had bantered back and forth with him, unlike how Roxy would roll her eyes and dismiss him as a flirt. More often than not, Taylor's side of the flirting with Tag included heavy reminders of their vast age difference. You're full of it, Tag Turner, like always. I got a baby now, and I'm married to a man you can only dream of being as handsome as. Roxy snorted. I wish you could see how wounded he looks right now, T. It was so natural to slip into this mode with him. The words surprised her at how easy they were to say, the way that once she'd smiled at him that morning, her lips just kept on smiling with him like they always had. She'd just have to make sure real quick that her lips knew that smiling was the limit of what they could do where it concerned him. You two do know that I've been voted country music's sexiest star 4 times, right? Psh! Taylor groaned. If country music ever laid eyes on Gavin, they'd have to rename the honor's second sexiest star after Gavin Bennett. You tell him, honey. Gavin's voice came from the background, making all of them laugh. So, Taylor said, what's going on? Roxy avoided looking over at Tag since curiosity was dripping off Taylor's voice the way Bellamy smothered her biscuits in butter. Roxy has a pretty little ranch out here that seemed like the perfect place to write a new album. We're hiking Paintbrush today, Tag answered. Aw, I love that trail. I can't tell you how jealous I am. It makes you rethink city life, doesn't it? Roxy tilted her head at the nostalgic tone Taylor had taken, the same nostalgia that had wafted off her post about Tag's concert back in July and how she couldn't be there. She'd never heard her sister miss Little River so much. Gavin had grown up in Denver, and before having Tucker, they'd traveled to cities all over the globe for Gavin's job. She thought Taylor thrived on her new city life. At least, that had been the vibe Roxy got whenever Taylor subtly suggested that Roxy wouldn't shrivel and die if she ever wanted to think twice about rejecting Tag or moving to Nashville to be with him. Tag glanced out the window at the trees passing by. It sure does, he agreed. What do you need? Roxy broke in. The last thing she needed was Taylor convincing Tag to spend even more time back in Wyoming. Oh, I was just calling about Christmas to see what your plans were. I think we're going to come home. Oh? Roxy sat back in surprise. I thought you were all gung-ho on going to Rio and staying out of the cold. I miss Christmas on the ranch, but we'll talk about it later. I don't want to hog your catching up time with Tag. Roxy gripped the steering wheel harder at the insinuation in that statement and avoided Tag's gaze. "Don't tell anyone he's here, T," Roxy said before her sister hung up. "It's a big secret. We all had to sign non-disclosure statements." "Sexiest country music stars tend to attract big followings," Tag interjected. Taylor snorted. "My lips are stilled. You two have fun." "Thanks," Roxy said too brightly and hurriedly jabbed at the end button before Taylor got specific about the kind of fun the two should have. Tag glanced over at her with a smirk. He turned back to the window, leaning forward as they passed a large meadow rising in the distance. A herd of elk nestled into the horseshoe shape of it. "You think you'll keep your land pristine for the rest of your life?" he asked in a soft voice. The almost reverence in his tone sort of startled her. The ranch had been a bitter thorn in their relationship for much of their friendship. He'd always teased her for having too deep roots in their small town and not being able to accept that she might like somewhere else just as much, somewhere like Nashville with him. He'd thrown that accusation at her that night in Laramie, and only then did she recognize how he might have meant it all those times before. That she was so stuck in Little River she didn't even consider what their future together could be. And she hadn't. He'd always been bound for stardom, so perhaps that had never allowed her to recognize all those times he'd insisted he loved her, that he might have been telling the truth. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I don't want to do anything like develop it with houses or something like that. I don't think the area could support that kind of thing. Maybe some vacation homes, but that doesn't seem right." She gave a sigh, expecting him to scorn her old-fashioned sense of land ownership. "No," he agreed. Was this part of Tag's tactic? Making overt attacks on her heart with his flirting and music while subtly sneaking his way in with supposed changes of heart over her family's legacy? But he still stared out the window, a look of total concentration on his face, like he was seeing the land for the first time ever, or seeing it the way Roxy had all her life. So that made the next word slip out of her mouth, and she was suddenly confiding in him the way she would have 8 years ago. "4-Star Energy wants me to lease mining rights for a vein of coal over by the old Mackenzie cabin. It would make a lot of money." He turned toward her, but to her relief his tone held the same hesitancy that wound through her every time she thought of the offer. "It doesn't feel right either," she confessed. "I don't think it's enough to be worth it. It feels like they would come in, sweep it out, and leave a mess behind them to ruin my pretty ranch." She softened this observation with a smile and shrugged. "Sounds like Quinn is trying to help you out with some other ideas." He leaned his shoulder against the window and turned toward her. The way he talked about this, like he cared that she cared, scared her. Scared her because it seemed like he finally might understand the life she'd chosen. Not that he wanted it for himself, or maybe didn't even want it for her, but that he didn't blame her as much anymore. And if he didn't blame her, she couldn't really keep blaming him. If all that anger died away, she might only be left with the feeling she'd been running away from since he ran away from her. Had all that hurt for him ignoring her all this time stemmed from the fact that she did love him more than as her best friend, and not just because he'd exploded their friendship and run off when it didn't turn out his way? She asked me what I thought about a solar utility project. They have something down in Sweetwater County that sounds interesting. She kept her eyes glued to the road, not ready to face any more of this like we're still normal conversation head on. "That sounds more like you." Roxy gripped the steering wheel again. Tag had a soft tone and sort of husky. It came out in some of his more romantic songs, and it had been a driving reason she'd stopped listening to him. A week after he'd walked out on her in Laramie, a song came on the radio with a slow section where his voice rasped over some painfully sad lyrics. Lyrics she'd known she must have inspired with her many clueless rejections. It had stripped away all her high-road justifications for refusing to follow his dreams, showed her in that one moment that broken-hearted man she'd pushed away, made her worry that she had loved him just like he'd said he loved her. She'd turned off the music app on her phone and never listened to him again, always skipped to the next song the moment she heard the familiar openings of his songs in a playlist. And when the new ones started coming, from the first note she recognized his voice. She'd even spent a year or so immersed in pop music, but he would always show up there too with his many crossover hits. "Yeah," she said in a quiet voice and drew back in on herself. And even though she spent the rest of the 30-minute drive up to the Paintbrush Springs Trail reminding herself to keep things normal, she couldn't bring herself to start up a conversation again, to risk him sweet-talking her and finally making her believe it. And he didn't press her with more conversation. The one glance she snuck of him showed him staring out the window, one corner of his lips turned up in a smile. When they reached the head of the trail, she pulled the small backpack she'd brought, filled with a water bottle, a couple of granola bars, and a jacket in case the summer day turned chilly. She was placing one of her earbuds in when Tag came up behind her and plucked the earbud out, making quick work of stealing her phone and holding it high above him. No electronics on the trail, Rox. You know the rules. Oh, no, Roxy shook her head and held out her hand. Those rules don't apply. He took a step forward, moving into her space and filling it up with his entire presence. Broad shoulders filled her view, making her tilt her head up to look at him. Tag had grown quickly in high school, reaching his full 6'4" height by their senior year. But in 8 years, his shoulders and arms had turned much more muscled. The scruff over his chin that he'd let grow since he arrived clean-shaven yesterday, dark and sexier than the soft hairs he'd declared so much pride over back then. The 18-year-old boy that had wrapped her up in his arms, bent his head over hers to kiss her and beg her to come with him, had made electricity hum through her. The man who stood before her now hadn't even touched her yet, and every piece of her insides was on fire. Does that mean all the rules don't apply? Oh, that husky voice. Don't run away, don't run away. You have got this, Roxy Adams. Ha, 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 ha. The shrill breathiness to her forced laugh gave way every one of her secrets. With every syllable, Tag's smile stretched wider and wider. Admit it, Rox. Admit you love me. They sat on the tailgate of her dad's pickup the night of graduation. He had on a smirk, so she rolled her eyes at his flirting. They'd just hiked the Ten Falls Trail, one of their favorite nighttime trails, and now Tag sat next to her, their shoulders and legs touching, keeping out the evening chill. As big as these mountains, she said, waving a hand around her. They'd been best friends for well over 4 years now. Of course she loved him, though not like he always teased. But it's not big enough. She hadn't meant for him to hear that serious thought. Thinking of him leaving her behind had hurt since he'd told her he was definitely leaving right after graduation. He had leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. That's plenty big. It's just that I love you more, as big as the stars. He pointed to the vast spread of twinkling lights above them, clearer on top of the mountains than anywhere in the valley below. She thought of his plans, the duffel bag he had packed in his room, the close friendship she knew, just knew, would fade away with him leaving. Then why are you leaving me? She whispered. Why aren't you coming with? Tag tossed her phone and headphones into the seat of her pickup, then turned and headed to the trailhead. It was probably the worst decision she'd made in several years, but she left the phone behind. She turned to study him.